Reserves. Gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record a Republican Ways and Means Committee release explaining that Senate Democrats voted down an amendment that would prevent increased audits on taxpayers making less than $400,000 a year, and House Democrats refused to take up a bill that would do the same.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith.
Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Nebraska. House Republicans made a promise to the American people to fight for working class families. And we made a promise that our first order of business under a new Republican majority would be repeal the $80 billion Democrats gave the IRS to hire 87,000 new agents to target American working class families. We are delivering on that promise today. This bill rescinds the IRS funds in the Inflation Reduction Act, a law that does nothing to combat inflation, but everything to empower an agency that has targeted Americans. They've leaked taxpayer information, and under the Biden administration, they threaten to snoop into the bank accounts of millions of middle-class families. We know this because President Biden wrote such a proposal into his first budget as part of his agenda to expand the power of the IRS and shovel billions more to this troubled agency. At that time, we asked the Joint Committee on Taxation how many Americans might be subject to such a scheme to spy into the bank accounts. The JCT said up to 134 million taxpayers could be targeted. So much for just going after the millionaires and the billionaires that our Democrat colleagues like to talk about. And while the Biden administration, including Treasury Secretary Yellen, has tried to dismiss concerns over how middle-class Americans would be targeted by the IRS under the Democrats' $80 billion infusion of cash, the Congressional Budget Office has affirmed that undoubtedly families making less than $400,000 per year would be subjected to increased enforcement and, yes, audits by the IRS. But of course, this would be the case when you realize that more than half of the $80 billion Democrats gave the IRS is earmarked for enforcement. The IRS does not need a raise. It needs a reckoning. And what starts today with rescinding this $80 billion continues through rigorous IRS oversight that Democrats ignored under the one-party rule. Taxpayers deserve true oversight for an agency that leaked the tax returns of thousands of American taxpayers at the same time the White House was calling for tax increases on those individuals. We are talking about an agency with a history of targeting conservatives, with woefully underperforming customer service, and whose own commissioner under Obama called this $80 billion more than 3 times the amount of money the agency actually needed. House Republicans are ready to provide oversight and accountability, and that starts today with ending this $80 billion pay raise. I yield back.
Reserve. Gentleman.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, for your testimony. Without objection, each member will be recognized for 3.5 minutes to accommodate the Treasury Secretary's time. As always, we have to ensure that all members have an opportunity to ask questions of the Secretary. We'll now proceed to questions and answers session, and I'll begin with it first. Yesterday, Secretary, I sent you a letter asking that you provide this committee with legislative language that would accomplish the $4.7 trillion in tax increases contained in your budget proposal within 30 days. The American people, they deserve to know exactly how the Biden administration plans to raise their taxes and the impacts those policies will have on them. So without objection, the letter is entered into the record that I sent you yesterday. So Secretary Yellen, will you commit to providing that legislative text within 30 days to the committee?
Chairman Smith, yesterday the Treasury Department published the so-called Green Book, giving a great deal of detail about all of the proposed changes on the revenue side in this year's budget, and I believe that provides the detail that is necessary to consider these proposals. The Treasury Department always stands ready to work with this committee and members of Congress on tax legislation as you consider it. And of course, we stand ready to do that.
Yeah, I've looked at the Green Book, and we appreciate you all giving it to us yesterday afternoon. It does not provide the legislative text of the tax proposals of $4.7 trillion that your budget calls for. And so what we were asking for the legislative text, so you're not going to send us the legislative text in 30 days?
I don't believe that has ever been done.
I was just
Congress
asking,
usually,
but if, okay.
As I say, we stand ready to work with you as you consider particular proposals, and we'll certainly look at legislative language and give you our feedback. But
if you will present the legislative text to us on your $4.7 trillion in tax proposals, we'd be happy to look at that. And we hope that since that's in your budget, you'll ask that. Last year, Democrats in Congress rammed through $80 billion in mandatory funding for the IRS after your department asked for it in conjunction with the president's first budget proposal. Your plan called for the IRS to monitor nearly every American bank account, to hire 87,000 new employees, and to audit over 1 million more Americans each year, with the majority falling on working-class Americans. The IRS still hasn't given me the plan for the $80 billion and how that $80 billion will be spent, even though we have sent several letters. We've spoken on the phone about that. But that can't be right, Secretary Yellen, that you all don't have a plan yet. Your budget request that was submitted yesterday asked for $14.1 billion in annual appropriations for fiscal year 2024. But that's not all, Secretary. Buried on page 209 of that Green Book that you just highlighted, which explains your proposals, Treasury is asking for an additional $29.1 billion in mandatory funding to, quote, continue IRA-funded enforcement and compliance initiatives and investments. None of that money is dedicated to customer service or IT modernization. Obviously, you all have a plan. You're already funding enforcement and compliance initiatives that have not been disclosed to Congress and the American public. You already got $80 billion for the IRS. Now you want $43.2 billion more, all without explaining what will be done with the first $80 billion. The American people, they deserve to know how their hard-earned tax dollars are being spent and the impact that a supercharged IRS will have on them. So how many more IRS agents will this $43.2 billion get us?
So first, let me say that the strategic operating plan that we've promised to deliver, we will deliver in the
And you'll make that
coming
public
weeks.
to us.
Yes, it will be provided to you.
Thank you.
In the coming weeks. And already we've taken very important steps to improve customer service. The IRS has hired 5,000 additional customer service representatives. I promised that the average level of service in answering taxpayer inquiries this tax season would rise to 85%. And while it varies from week to week, so far we are certainly in that 80 to 90% range. Tax assistance centers are up and operating. Ones that had been closed due to lack of resources are in the process of being reopened. And many of these centers are open on Saturdays to provide help to consumers. Anyone this tax season, any American attempting to get help from the IRS is experiencing a very different environment.
That's good. So, Secretary, audits is something that people really care about. Will there be increased audits on working class families with this new appropriations?
I have directed already that IRA resources will not be used to increase the share of households or small businesses earning less than $400,000 or less that are audited relative to historic levels. And I promise and will ensure that that mandate will be met. And let's remember—
So that's great news. That's great news, Secretary. That's one common thing that we will have. But part of our oversight duties will be make sure that there's not increased audits for small businesses and working families. I do want to go on. We are getting close to 2 years since ProPublica revealed that it had obtained what is called a vast trove of IRS data, including extensive information on the tax returns of thousands of Americans, sufficient to detail their income, taxes, investments, and even the results of audits. You've been asked several times about this issue in public, and always note that you've referred the matter to the Inspector General and the Department of Justice for review. You've also said previously that you take this very seriously, but this is not an issue that can be referred elsewhere and then completely ignored. The American people, they deserve to know that their confidential information is safe at the IRS, and they deserve answers about what happened. Other than refer the matter elsewhere, what actions have you taken in the last 20 months to identify and fix potential vulnerabilities in how the IRS maintains confidential taxpayer information?
Listen, I want to say that I share the same frustration that you're expressing. I would really like to get to the bottom of this. We care deeply about taxpayer privacy, and an unauthorized disclosure of taxpayer information is illegal and something to be taken very seriously. I'm frustrated because we have taken the actions that are appropriate, namely to refer this matter to the appropriate independent investigators, and that includes Treasury's Office of Inspector General, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, and the Department of Justice. All of these agencies conduct their investigations independently, and according to timelines they determine are necessary and appropriate for a complete investigation. I am waiting to see, just as you are, what the outcome of those investigations are.
So you've done no internal audits within Treasury yourself to see if there might have been any kind of leak or any kind of vulnerabilities in protecting taxpayers' confidential information?
These are the agencies that are independent, and
so you're letting them do it?
That's what is appropriate.
Okay,
in this
thank you,
situation.
Madam Secretary. As you know, we've established a portal to allow IRS employees to share information with this committee about any kind of conduct that's going on at the IRS that they think that we should know of, since we're the Committee of Jurisdiction for Oversight. I sent a letter to the IRS and asked that it be shared with all IRS employees. The agency has thus far refused to do so. That is completely unacceptable. IRS employees should know the options they have to report wrongdoing to Congress that they may witness at work. This is a simple issue. It's about basic transparency and accountability. Will you commit to sharing information about our IRS whistleblower portal with IRS employees?
Well, I want to say that we have very strong whistleblower
No, that's what I've heard. But would you?
protections.
My question is will you share our whistleblower with the IRS employees? Yes or no?
I think what is important is that IRS employees know what their full set of options are, and they certainly can report to this committee. They can report to other committees.
But will you share
Congress.
this whistleblower information to your IRS employees? Yes or no?
I will make sure that they have the appropriate information that they know what their obligations are and their full set of obligations and full set
So
of
does that include this whistleblower
possibilities are.
hotline? Does that include this whistleblower hotline, that that's something you'll share with them?
I will make sure that they know all of the options that they have.
Does that include
If
this
they-
whistleblower hotline?
It includes this committee, certainly.
In this whistleblower hotline? It's yes or no.
We'll make sure that they are aware.
I hope that you
of
do,
their-
for the sake of the American public and for the sake of your IRS employees. On February 16th of this year, President Biden issued an executive order on advancing racial equity through the federal government. That was on February 16th. Treasury Department officials have repeatedly said they want to design tax compliance around racial equity. These statements create the implication that the IRS should take into consideration race and gender in how it manages tax compliance and decides who to audit. But tax returns do not ask taxpayers to identify themselves by race. So the IRS doesn't even have the data on race. That's where the president's executive order comes in. The order instructs the federal government to apply an equity focus to several areas, including to, quote, prevent and remedy discrimination, including by protecting the public from various discrimination. It seems clear that this executive order is instructing the IRS to change its process to make audit decisions based on taxpayers' race. Secretary Yellen, do you think there is any circumstance where the IRS should consider a person's race or gender when deciding whether someone should be audited?
The IRS doesn't know an individual's race, and we are certainly not proposing that race be reported on tax returns. However, the IRS does need to be careful to ensure that there is fairness in tax administration. And when studies like some that have recently been published suggest that algorithms that the IRS may be using are racially biased in the sense they are much more likely to audit, for example, taxpayers of color rather than others with exactly similar circumstances. It's important for the IRS to become aware of that and to make sure that the procedures that they use are fair. But that certainly does not mean looking at race and deciding whom to audit.
So in regards to audits and fairness, you'll never use race or gender in deciding audits?
Race is not available, and as I said, it's important for the IRS to make sure that their tax administration
So if race
is
isn't,
fair.
if race isn't available, your statement about the algorithmics that goes after racial preferences.
Well, the investigators were able to infer that the algorithm had that impact in spite of the fact that they weren't certain what the race was of any particular individual. They used methods to infer that. And this is a more general matter that algorithms are often used. They're sometimes used by those who provide credit. They're not based on race, but it may turn out that they are indirectly, and unintentionally using race, and it's important to understand and correct that when it's occurring.
Without objection, the President's executive order is entered into the record, and I recognize the gentleman from.
For whether questions he cares to pose to our panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Chairman Smith, from my understanding, the Biden administration's extreme and radical budget for FY24, it included $5 trillion worth of tax increases. Is that correct?
It did. $5 trillion worth of tax increases, which was a huge win that this piece of legislation did not have any tax increases. It's not that the administration didn't try to put tax increases in the negotiations on working class families, but Speaker McCarthy and his team was able to prevent that from happening.
And there's also provisions in this regarding work requirements, permitting reform. Would you like to talk about how that would actually grow the economy?
Absolutely. In regards to the work requirements of the changes of SNAP and also TANF, this will help lift people out of poverty. This will help guide the path where it's more an incentive to work than to have a government check. It will help with the labor shortage, something that is extremely important. When you travel anywhere across America, there's help wanted signs everywhere, and this is a factor that is extremely helpful when you're looking at the proposals that's within it.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Chairman Estes, it's my understanding that since President Biden took office, we've been on a trajectory in the next 10 years to add $10 trillion to our spending trajectory. Am I correct in that?
Yes, it is. Just showing from standpoint of when I came here 6 years ago, it would have taken $6 trillion to close the gap of spending over a 10-year period. Now that's up to almost 16. If you look at President Biden's proposed budget for the next 10 years, it actually raises the deficit by $17 trillion over that 10-year period.
And how does this bill help to counter that extreme spending?
So the focus of the bill, and particularly the first 6 years, is putting a cap on what is being budgeted to go through that process so that we can put limits on a year-to-year basis of the amount of money that is budgeted and then therefore spent, and also including the economic growth provisions that we put into the bill. Those provisions will help make sure the economy grows. And actually, one of the things that we've seen is a strong, health economy generates more tax revenue that comes into the federal government. I'll just use as an example, after we did the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, passed that in 2017, Congressional Budget Office estimated that there would be roughly $4.00 trillion in tax revenue in the year 2022. What we actually saw was $4.9 trillion. So positive activity, positive tax revenue from economic growth, which helps make sure that we can fund our obligations.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Chairman Smith, did you have anything you wanted to add? I saw you.
Yes, Representative. I would just add that from just the last 2.5 years, we've not had spending caps. And under 2 years of that 2.5 years, it was one-party Democrat rule where they controlled the White House, the House, and the Senate. And you saw an increase of $10 trillion in spending with no caps. You also saw an increase in discretionary spending within that window of 16% of an increase with no caps. However, the years prior to that, the 10 years prior to that, we had caps. And you only saw discretionary spending increase on average of 2.5%. So the provisions in here with the 6-year caps will make a huge impact because our country right now is not operating on any kind of cap.
Thank you, Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for any questions he has for the panel.
Thank you.
Chairman Smith, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Cole, Ranking Member McGovern. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to say a few words about the legislation before us that addresses the debt ceiling, and it begins to address the spending binge that got us here. Let's start by talking about why we are here a mere few days prior to potential default. It's because the Biden administration refused to come to the table until 100 days after Speaker McCarthy said, "Let's talk." even though polls show the majority of Americans, they want a debt ceiling agreement where Congress can cut spending. The refusal to negotiate was a deliberate decision on the part of the White House. It wasted a lot of time and stoked a lot of fear. I should note for my colleagues that Democrats could have raised the debt limit last year when they controlled the House of Representatives. The fact is, we are here because after the last debt limit increase, Democrats blew through the $2.5 trillion debt ceiling increase in 399 days. That's more than $6 billion in new debt issued per day. And when Democrats controlled all of Washington, they increased spending by $10 trillion. And what did the American people get? They got the worst inflation crisis in a generation. Rising interest rates, making their mortgage, their car loan, or small business loan harder to afford. And a trail of wasteful spending of federal tax dollars on everything from golf courses to ski resorts, beach bathrooms, to stimulus checks for prisoners. The only reason we have a solution before us, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, is because Republicans acted responsibly from day one. We called for negotiations. We put forward a plan and passed it in the House of Representatives. We listened to the American people who are tired of the reckless spending and want Congress to behave responsibly. The bill is not everything everyone wanted, but it delivers for the American people on several fronts. For example, it claws back pandemic-era funding that is so clearly no longer needed. This bill will be the largest rescission of previously authorized taxpayer dollars ever signed into law. The bill text is comprised of 20 pages canceling plans to spend tax dollars on wasteful projects. 1/5 of the bill is rescinding projects. It puts the brakes on the past 2 years of Washington's reckless runaway spending. For 10 years, we had discretionary spending caps in Washington. But during 2 years of complete Democrat control, all of that went away. What we saw was an explosion of discretionary spending. For 10 years, we had average annual discretionary growth of roughly 2.5%. Over the last 2 years, the pot of spending for discretionary spending has grown by 16%. This bill also helps more Americans escape poverty. The common sense work requirements will flip the switch on the status quo that right now pays Americans more to stay at home than to find a job. This bill downsizes the outrageous pay raise the IRS was given under one-party Democrat rule. An IRS that with every passing day shows itself less and less deserving of the American people's trust, never mind more of their tax dollars. The Fiscal Responsibility Act brings back administrative pay-go. Had something like that been in place for the last 2 years, the Biden administration would not have been able to issue over $1 trillion worth of executive actions without first finding savings to offset those actions. This bill also reinforces an important precedent. Even from when President Biden was a senator and when he was vice president, the debt ceiling ought to be the mechanism that forces parties to the table to negotiate ways to address Washington's spending habit. It's a shame that it took this long for the president to do the responsible thing. The American people didn't have to wait those 100 days he chose to sit on the sidelines. But we have an agreement now and an opportunity to deliver some big wins for the American people. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Representative Thompson, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member McGovern. I'm testifying today on behalf of the Ways and Means Committee,
The Ways and Means Committee is charged with ensuring that the tax code is enforced fairly. Clearly, the president only believes in making taxpayers pay their fair share if they don't share his last name. These two courageous whistleblowers provided my committee with devastating testimony showing that the government is not treating all taxpayers equally, and the DOJ and the IRS gave preferential treatment to the president's son during a criminal investigation into his taxes. These individuals in front of us today are credible and set for nearly 15 hours of interviews with both Republicans and Democrats. I personally took part in the interview with Mr. Ziegler. Here's what we learned from the interviewees. The IRS recommended multiple felony charges against Hunter Biden for tax years 2014 through 2019, relating to at least $8.3 million in income from foreign companies, including companies based in China, Romania, and Ukraine. And that is the only amount discovered despite the roadblocks and obstruction their investigation faced. The Department of Justice engaged in a campaign to delay, divulge, and deny that investigation. They delayed investigators for years, leading to the expiration of the statute of limitations for many of the crimes involved. They divulged key investigative details to Biden's attorneys and even the president's transition team. And they denied investigators the ability to authenticate evidence, serve warrants, question witnesses, and bring charges. This led to Hunter Biden's sweetheart agreement, announced 5 years after the investigation started, but mere days before my committee voted to publicly release this testimony. Would Americans in my congressional district or any other congressional district ever receive this same treatment? After raising their concerns internally at the IRS, these whistleblowers were discouraged and demoralized and turned to Congress as a last resort. They bravely reported wrongdoing to us. And what have President Biden's allies, including Hunter Biden's lawyers, done? They've responded with a vicious smear campaign to discredit these whistleblowers and discourage others from coming forward, and may have even coordinated with the White House on this effort. This is a disgrace. I urge any IRS employee watching today, if you know of misconduct, please come to the Ways and Means Committee so we can hold accountable those who are responsible. And let me be clear, there will be zero tolerance for any retaliation against whistleblowers by DOJ and the IRS. The American people expect answers about whether the federal government is treating all taxpayers equally or if the wealthy and politically connected get special treatment. Our committees are working together to get to the bottom of this abuse of power, and will work tirelessly to do so and to make sure it doesn't ever happen again. Americans should not have to accept 2 tiers of justice in this country. One if your last name is Biden, and one for everybody else. I want to thank both whistleblowers for coming forward publicly and for your testimony today. I yield to Mr. Jordan.
Now recognize the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Smith.
Let me begin by thanking Chairman Kelly for allowing me here and for your leadership. We are incredibly grateful that you are at the realm of this committee with your experience, your knowledge, and your passion. And glad to have you leading our tax writing committee. Mr. Plowgen, no one in the Biden administration has the power to write U.S. tax policy. The Supreme Court has said that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. It is among the most solemn responsibilities of government. And under the Constitution, it is strictly controlled. The power to tax demands the highest level of accountability to the American people, especially when masses of jobs are at risk. And while every member seated here today is accountable to voters, you and Secretary Yellen are not. I have 8 specific questions on Treasury's engagement with the tax writing committees over the OECD negotiations, and I ask that you please just answer yes or no. Was Congress consulted prior to Treasury agreeing to a UTPR surtax that would allow foreign governments to tax the U.S. operations of U.S. companies?
We did receive input from Congress on the UTPR during the
So that's a yes?
negotiations.
That's a yes?
We did receive input from Congress, yes.
Okay, I have followed this issue very closely over the past 3 years, and I don't think that's the case. I know that Treasury has never consulted with Republican members prior to a decision. And unless you would like to revise your testimony, please provide to this committee in writing the date of the consultation, the names of Treasury personnel involved, and the names of members of Congress that Treasury met with. Can you get me that information?
We get input from Congress in many different ways, from
Can
hearings,
you give me that information?
from letters, from consultation with staff as well.
Yes or no? Can you provide this committee that information?
I do not have that information currently.
So how do you know what you just testified before Congress is accurate?
We receive input from Congress in multiple ways. As I said, through
What are those
hearings-
multiple ways and from what members?
Through hearings, through letters from Congress.
What
from
hearing?
members. The Treasury is called before House Ways and Means. The Secretary Yellen has testified before Ways and Means.
Testified after she made the negotiations in regards to it.
We receive letters from members as well.
Let me ask you another question. Was Congress consulted prior to Treasury accepting this recent offer by foreign countries to delay the UTPR surtax by just 1 year?
Again, we received input from Congress and from taxpayers with concerns.
You did not consult with the chairman of the tax writing committee, so who did you consult with?
We received input from the tax writing committees on the UTPR and concerns about.
No one from our committee on the Republican side. So was it only the Democrat side you spoke with?
We speak with staff of the tax writing committee on a bipartisan basis on a regular basis.
Did you, in regards to this delay for 1 year, did you speak to the majority in the tax writing committee of Ways and Means?
We received input on concerns about the UTPR and concerns about application of the UTPR to parent jurisdictions, especially in the early years of
You received letters from us,
Pillar 2.
but did you consult with us before this decision? Yes or no?
We speak with the tax writing committees on a regular basis.
Well, I'm the
Received
chairman
that
of this
input.
committee, and it's almost crickets. So you might want to do a little bit better in regards to that. Was Congress consulted prior to Treasury agreeing that the U.S. R&D credit would be disadvantaged versus the R&D credits of other countries like the UK?
I cannot speak to that decision. That decision, this has been an ongoing process for multiple years, and that is a long-standing distinction in the Pillar 2 rules.
Yeah, it's pretty detrimental to U.S. businesses. Were you part of the negotiation?
I rejoined Treasury in October of 2021. The Pillar 2 negotiations have been going on since 2018.
So since 2021, when you were in the negotiations, R&D hasn't been discussed around you?
We have raised the R&D credit as an important issue in the negotiations.
Did anyone in Congress sign off on the decision to give generous, refundable corporate tax credits and Chinese state subsidies an advantage over more typical tax incentives like those enacted by Congress on a bipartisan basis? Yes or no?
Again, I was not part of the negotiations when that decision was made. That's been an issue in the Pillar 2 negotiations that's longstanding.
Can you find that answer out for me?
I will check on that and come back to you.
I would love that to be submitted. Did Treasury consult with Congress prior to Treasury conceding that the U.S. GILTI rule would not receive full grandfathering status as the only global minimum tax in the world? Yes or no?
I was not part of the negotiations at that juncture.
So once again, can you provide me the answer to that question with whoever at Treasury that was?
I will check on that.
Did anyone in Congress sign off on Treasury's decision to surrender U.S. tax revenues from GILTI and Subpart F because of the OECD's preference for local corporate minimum taxes?
You're speaking about the qualified domestic minimum taxes. So we, again, received input on that. The qualified domestic minimum taxes are consistent with all international tax rules that provide the primary taxing right to a jurisdiction when it taxes its residents on income that arises
I understand what it is, but my
jurisdiction.
question was, did anyone in Congress sign off on Treasury's decision?
Again, we receive input from Congress in many ways.
Once again, I ask, unless you would like to revise your testimony, please provide to the committee in writing the date of the consultation with the members of Congress, the names of Treasury personnel involved, and the names of members of Congress that Treasury met with. Did anyone in Congress sign off on the decision for a 15% global minimum tax rate to replace the 12 to 13% rate that the OECD was considering prior to President Biden taking office?
I was not part of the negotiations at that stage.
Can you get that information for the committee?
I will check on that.
Was Congress consulted prior to Treasury agreeing on the scope of the Pillar 1 profit allocation, which skews heavily against U.S. companies while exempting their foreign headquartered competitors?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Was Congress, once again, was Congress consulted prior to Treasury agreeing on the scope of the Pillar 1 profit allocation, which skews heavily against U.S. companies while exempting their foreign headquartered competitors?
I don't think that it exempts foreign MNEs under Pillar 1, so I'm not sure I understand the
From my understanding, it does. So would you be opposed to it if it did not exempt those foreign headquartered competitors?
Sorry,
Would Treasury be opposed to it?
I don't think that it does exempt foreign headquartered multinationals in Pillar 1.
So in regards to Pillar 1 profit allocation period, did Treasury consult with any members of Congress?
We continue to consult with Congress about Pillar 1. Pillar 1 remains open. There are many open issues on Pillar 1.
So it goes back to my simple question. You said, yes, you have. I would love for you all to provide in writing to this committee who you consulted with, what members of Treasury that consulted with us, and what date. If Treasury had consulted with Congress, we would have avoided the multitude of Biden administration losses in the OECD negotiations. My final question, most observers are skeptical that China will ever truly comply with this OECD agreement. Secretary Yellen recently traveled to China to meet with the Chinese Communist Party officials. During that trip, was she able to obtain commitments from China that it would adopt the OECD agreement and implement it fairly?
Secretary Yellen did meet with her Chinese counterparts, and in an attempt to reset the relationship with China, I do not know whether they spoke about Pillar 2, but the UTPR is an important part of Pillar 2 that ensures that China and other jurisdictions do not gain an advantage if they do not adopt Pillar 2. And that's why the UTPR is an important part of Pillar 2. It provides an enforcement mechanism that ensures that Chinese multinationals will be subject to the same minimum tax as other multinationals.
We know China's really not that great of following rules and agreements. We've seen that with our country. That's why I was hopeful that the Treasury Secretary, in her long visit to China, would definitely have talked to them about whether they would adopt OECD and the agreement and implement it fairly. Since it's so important, I figured that would be top of her list. Whether by manipulating financial statements or by creating new state subsidies, China will find ways to evade these OECD rules and allowing CCP-supported companies to gain a competitive advantage against the United States is yet another failure in these negotiations by the Biden administration. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Questions? Yes.
Mr. Chairman, question just about the timing of all of this. You're talking about a two-tiered system of justice. If I'm not mistaken, August 7th, 2020, Bill Barr was the Attorney General and Donald Trump was the president. So explain to me where the two-tiered system of justice comes into play. And then the WhatsApp message you have, I believe is dated June 6, 2017. Joe Biden is not vice president or even a candidate for president at that time. So where is the direct connection to some sort of criminal malfeasance within these two pieces of evidence?
Well, I think the facts speak for themselves. There's over 700 pages of examples of where people should be very concerned. When you're talking about what was your first question?
The timing of this is August 7th, 2020. Bill Barr's the Attorney General. Donald Trump's the president.
Yeah, and Leslie Wolf is a career employee. She was not a political appointee, and she was the one obstructing the investigation. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. We need to make sure that the Department of Justice works for all people and doesn't treat those who are politically connected or wealthy much differently. And unfortunately, we have several examples that came forward by the two IRS whistleblowers that proves that people are treated differently because they're politically
But
connected.
haven't you suggested that Joe Biden being the president now is unfairly treating Donald Trump in his indictments?
What I'm talking about is the 700 pages that we have before us, which is all the information that came from the IRS whistleblowers, and that's what we're releasing right now. And I'll tell you, I would encourage everyone in this room to look at those 700 pages. If you think it's okay with what's in it, then we live on two different planets.
Can you explain the timing then of the August 6th WhatsApp message? Why is that evidence of some wrongdoing?
I'm not an expert on the timeline. I would love to have President Biden and his family to tell us about all the timelines, because it's really, really unfortunate that we see so many meetings and so many phone calls that involved around official activity that the vice president has been participating in, and then big sums of money follows later.
But if he's not the president or the vice president at that time, where's the wrongdoing? He wasn't even a candidate for president at that time.
He was a candidate.
In August 6th of 2017?
Apparently, what source are you with?
I'm with NBC.
So apparently you'll never believe us.
I'm not saying I don't believe you. I'm asking you a very direct question. You presented a piece of evidence that you say came on August 6, 2017, that demonstrates that Joe Biden was using political influence to help his son. If he wasn't a political figure at that time, the first WhatsApp message you put up, where you talk about the brand, and I'm completely open-minded about this. I'm asking you specifically, how does that demonstrate that there's some sort of political influence being put over him if at that time he is not he's not an elected official?
I'm definitely not going to pinpoint one item. I think we've outlined.
You presented it. It was your first thing that you brought up.
So apparently you don't agree with it. So
it's not that I don't agree with it. I'm asking you to explain it.
I'll take the next question. Yes. Moments ago, the Ways and Means Committee, we voted to release over 700 pages of additional material provided to the committee by two IRS whistleblowers, Gary Shapley and Joseph Ziegler, who came forward at great risk to their careers and reputations to bring to light evidence of corruption and misconduct within our federal government. On June 22nd, the committee voted to release the initial testimony of the two IRS whistleblowers that showed wrongdoing and misconduct at both the Department of Justice and the IRS. Their testimony then also shed light on a complex and lucrative enterprise operated by the Biden family to enrich themselves to the tune of at least $20 million, with much of Hunter Biden's share going unreported for taxes. In the months since, no one has offered any evidence that contradicts Mr. Shapley and Mr. Ziegler's testimony. In fact, much of their testimony has been supported by additional IRS witnesses who set for transcribed interviews after being subpoenaed by this committee. The new information we just voted to release today further confirms their testimony. Let's look at what the new evidence released today shows. 1, it is clear that then Vice President Joe Biden's political power and influence was, quote, the brand that Hunter Biden was selling all over the world. Even more alarming, the Biden family foreign influence peddling operation suggests an effort to sway U.S. policy decisions. From documents released just moments ago, as you can see in the WhatsApp message behind me, from June 6, 2017, Hunter Biden explicitly wrote to a business associate that he was not willing to, quote, sign over my family's brand, close quote, or give this individual, quote, the keys to my family's only asset. That asset could only be one person, Joe Biden. IRS investigators provided worksheets they compiled as part of their investigation into Hunter Biden's tax crimes, which connect his business activities to official government activity while Joe Biden served as Vice President of the United States. This is new and alarming material the committee just made public. The very existence of this file makes it abundantly clear that IRS investigators were concerned there was in fact a connection between Hunter Biden's global influence peddling, Joe Biden, and official U.S. government activity. In one example, investigators documented how then Vice President Biden's April 2014 official visit to Ukraine occurred only days after a series of meetings between Hunter Biden, his business associate Devin Archer, senior staff within the Vice President's office, and Vice President Biden himself. We have received an email sent during that same time frame from an executive of Burisma, a Ukrainian company, to Devin Archer, saying a, quote, reasonable balance could be reached about Hunter Biden. 1 month later, Burisma announced Hunter Biden's appointment to its board. In another example from today's material, then Vice President Joe Biden hosted Hunter and 2 of his business associates, including billionaire Miguel Alemán, at the White House in February of 2014, where they had lunch, quote, in Dad's office. Just 3 months later, Hunter Biden sent an email to Devin Archer saying, quote, we need to get to Mexico City and cement the deal with Miguel. Public records show Joe Biden later used Air Force 2 to shuttle Hunter and another business associate, Jeff Cooper, to Mexico City in 2016. These documents also underline how Hunter Biden's role as, quote, door opener extended far beyond his father and includes numerous other meetings between Hunter Biden and senior U.S. government officials, including now Secretary of State Antony Blinken. 2, the evidence today shows the complexity and scale of the Biden family influence peddling scheme. Millions of dollars were flowing through subsidiaries and LLCs to avoid taxes and shield visibility into how the money from foreign sources, including countries like Ukraine, Russia, China, went to different entities and Biden family members. The additional whistleblower documents we just released specifically mentioned 23 foreign countries on 4 different continents with connections to Hunter Biden's business operations. The map behind me shows the sheer scale and scope of this global operation. Lastly, in the whistleblower's original testimony, we learned DOJ took unprecedented action to impede any investigative step that could have led investigators to President Joe Biden. As you can see here in this new material, the whistleblowers have provided an email in support of their earlier testimony where U.S. Attorney Leslie Wolf directs investigators to remove all mentions of, quote, political figure 1 from a search warrant. And who is political figure 1? I would think you would ask. That individual is none other than former Vice President Joe Biden. Here we see clear as day that the Department of Justice actively interfered in an investigation to protect the current president of the United States. Additionally, in January of 2022, Attorney Wolf declined to pursue campaign finance violations identified by investigators potentially related to more than $2 million in payments from Kevin Morris, a Democrat Party donor, to cover Hunter Biden's unpaid tax liabilities. In the documents we voted to release today, U.S. Attorney Wolf stated she, quote, is not personally interested in following the lead the investigators identified. Another piece of evidence implicating Joe Biden, and in this case, his presidential campaign, stopped dead in its tracks. In an interview with investigators, James Biden, the president's brother, stated that he did not know how Hunter Biden even knew Kevin Morris, who was paying Hunter Biden's taxes, or why Kevin Morris was helping Hunter Biden. The transcript of the interview contained in today's materials shows that James Biden told investigators Hunter Biden asked him to thank Mr. Morris for his payment, quote, on behalf of the family. It is reasonable to ask who requested that Kevin Morris cover Hunter Biden's tax liability, or whether he received something in return for his more than $2 million in payments to someone that he barely knew. Based on this evidence and much more in the documents we voted to release today, along with evidence obtained by the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committee, I have serious concerns about whether the President of the United States, Joe Biden, may be compromised by his son's foreign business dealings. I also have serious concerns about whether the President may be using his administration to protect himself and his family from scrutiny. The American people, they have a right to know their elected representatives are not abusing public office to enrich themselves or their families. They also have a right to know if federal law enforcement agencies are holding the powerful and the politically connected to the same standard of justice as everyone else.
I now yield to Jason Smith, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Comer. Yesterday, the Ways and Means Committee released new documents showing President Biden was not just aware of his son's business dealings, but he was connected to them. In a newly released message to a Chinese business executive, Hunter Biden mentions preserving the, quote, keys to my family's only asset. That asset? Joe Biden. New evidence released in response to questions raised by members of the committee on both sides when Gary Shapley and Joseph Ziegler, the two IRS whistleblowers, testified in July, paints a disturbing picture of a revolving door between Joe Biden's office and Hunter Biden's business partners. According to a worksheet provided by IRS whistleblower Ziegler, then Vice President Biden's April 2014 official visit to Ukraine occurred only days after a series of White House meetings with Hunter Biden and his business associates regarding Ukraine. Shortly after Joe Biden returned stateside, the Ukrainian company Burisma announced Hunter Biden's appointment to its board. New evidence provided shows Hunter Biden using his father's position to gain favor with billionaire Miguel Alemán, including having Joe Biden host them at the White House in February of 2014 at the vice president's residence alongside Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim in November of 2015, and then in 2016 using Air Force Two to shuttle Hunter Biden and his business associate to Mexico City. Whether it was lunches, phone calls, White House meetings, or official foreign trips, Hunter Biden cashed in by arranging access to Joe Biden, the family brand. The Biden family and their associates received millions in payments from foreign sources, including from Russia, China, Ukraine, Romania. In one email, Hunter Biden even bragged that he cut a deal for $10 million from just one company for, quote, introductions alone. And yet the DOJ wanted to keep the spotlight as far from Joe Biden as possible. One of the items we released yesterday was an IRS interview with James Biden, the president's brother, in September of 2022. The agency was barred in the interview from asking him about Joe Biden and about whether Joe Biden was involved in Hunter Biden's deal with a Chinese energy company. And when Hunter Biden had his tax liability of over $2 million mysteriously paid for by a Democrat Party donor named Kevin Morris, who he barely knew, something IRS investigators saw as a possible campaign finance violation, Assistant U.S. Attorney Leslie Wolf said she did not want any of the agents to look into the allegation. On the board are notes Agent Shapley took from that meeting. He notes that Wolf told investigators that she was not, quote, personally interested in pursuing it. This is the same attorney, Wolf, who in an email we released yesterday responded to IRS investigators seeking approval for a search warrant with, quote, there should be nothing about political figure one in here, that being a reference by definition of Joe Biden. The Biden family sold access to Joe Biden's power, and the Biden Justice Department protected the Biden brand. We must continue to follow the facts. I yield to Jim. I yield to Rep. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Chair Stefanik, for having us. Most Americans, they work hard to provide for their families. They follow the law. They pay their taxes. But the Biden family has been playing by different rules. Two brave whistleblowers came forward to expose the political interference impeding an investigation into the tax crimes of the president's son, Hunter Biden. These are serious, credible IRS investigators who risked their career to come forward. Amidst threats from those representing the president's son that anyone prosecuting the case would be committing career suicide. And as one might expect, they provided substantial evidence backing up their testimony that we have reviewed and released over the course of our work to hold government officials accountable. In the days since their initial testimony, we have learned that President Biden wasn't just aware of his son's business dealings. He wasn't just involved, but he appears to have directly benefited from them. This directly contradicts what President Biden said throughout his presidential campaign and while being president. We have learned about what can be described as the International Bank of Joe Biden, a lending scheme that saw special loans to Biden family members repaid with funds from Chinese executives. We have learned about a Hollywood attorney acting as a special benefactor by paying off at least $2 million of Hunter's tax debts in order to keep it out of the press at the beginning of the 2020 campaign. When confronted with this potential campaign finance violation, an assistant U.S. attorney refused to investigate because, quote, she was not personally interested in pursuing it. We have learned that DOJ officials went out of their way to remove the mention of political figure one, aka Joe Biden, from search warrants. As Ways and Means Chairman, there are three major aspects that fall into my committee's jurisdiction. First, we need to get to the bottom of what exactly happened at the Department of Justice and the IRS to impede the Hunter Biden investigation. Did Joe Biden use his administration to protect him from the scrutiny? Second, the Biden family appears to have used numerous accounts, transactions, and loans to mask the flow of money. If these loans were in fact legitimate, they should be interest income. There should be interest income reported on tax documents. Was such reported? Third, how did Hunter and his associates move money through the many shell companies that have been identified? Is there tax information that would help explain the complex web the Bidens created? Over the next week, the Ways and Means Committee will take further action to pursue the truth and follow the facts wherever they lead. We will be holding a hearing with the IRS whistleblowers to discuss the investigation as well as releasing additional material that they have provided. The American people expect no less. I am pleased to recognize the great majority whip from the state of Minnesota, Mr. Tom Emmer.